Welcome to Make UK's webinar, Preparing for Brexit, People and Migration. I'm Tim Thomas, Make UK's Director of Labour Market and Skills Policy. And during this session, we'll be looking at short-term business visits to the EU and what the position is in the event that the UK leaves the EU without a deal, otherwise called no deal Brexit. So I'm going to start by describing what the current position is. And on the slide before you is an outline of how businesses go about sending their UK-based workers into the EU currently, and that's whilst the UK is a member of the EU. And what I'm going to describe now is the process for sending any UK-based worker into the EU for what we call a short-term business visit. And that worker, they could be a UK worker or an EU worker or someone from the rest of the world. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that they're based normally in the UK, they live and work here, and they're being sent by the employer to work in the EU for a limited period of time. The only thing you need to remember at this particular part is that the intention of the worker is to return to the UK at some future point. And if that component is present, then they're called a posted worker. And the legal base for this is called the Posted Workers Directive, and it's part of the services part of the single market. It's not part of freedom of movement. Now, UK employers can send their UK-based workers to enter and work in the EU at the moment, but there is normally a compulsory notification process for each country that you're going to, and each country may have a slightly different notification process. Now, for the days that those UK-based workers are in the EU working, UK employers don't normally need to pay national insurance, and that's because there is a piece of EU law that says essentially if they're paying national insurance in the UK, then they don't also need to pay in the EU when they're working there. So a UK employer doesn't need to pay twice. But there is a tax form that's needed called an A1. Now, this tax form is essentially a certificate that says that the employer is paying the social security contribution in the UK, and therefore they don't need to pay in the EU as well. Having this tax form is also compulsory. So to this part of the mobility exercise, having the A1 form when the UK worker goes to EU to be posted is a compulsory requirement in all member states. So all employers will need to have an A1 for every worker that travels into the EU to work. So that's the position as part of the European Union. What happens if we leave without a deal? Well, clearly the previous arrangement ends because we'll have left the European Union and no longer be part of the single market. So UK workers will have no automatic right to travel into and work in the European Union, and UK-based employers will have no automatic right to trade or send their workers into the European Union. Now, the ability to work in these circumstances will then be governed by the individual laws of each member state. So France will have one set of rules, Germany will have another set of rules, Italy will have another set of rules, and they'll all be slightly different. The requirement to pay national insurance for your workers for the days that they're in the EU will be a matter for each individual member state to determine, and they'll all have individual rules. Each member state may require a local work permit for the workers for the days that they work in the EU. But there's a general principle of EU law that a member state cannot grant the UK, once it leaves, more favourable treatment or the same treatment as applies to an EU member state. So in other words, we can't leave and get the same deal that we get as a member. And what that means essentially is that UK employers are very likely to face an increased administrative burden and more red tape for short-term business trips after we leave the European Union. So what's the position again with no deal, and what's the checklist of things to be thinking about and doing? Well, from what I've said already, you'll see that it's important to check the individual rules of each member state because they'll all be different. Check who you are sending to the EU, and we know that most businesses don't automatically internally have a list of workers that they are sending to the EU and when and what for. And we know from speaking to members that very often the best records they have are travel records. How long will a worker be going there for? Because the rules for work permits might change if they're there for a day or a week or 2 or 3 months or longer. What will they be doing whilst they are there? So work permits generally are occupation specific. So it could be one work permit for an engineer or another work permit for someone doing design work, for example. Will they be engaging in regulated work? Now, we'll look at this in a future webinar, but broadly, qualifications and different types of work are regulated throughout most member states of the European Union. So, for example, the medical profession is generally regulated entirely. The legal profession, audit, accountancy, dentistry, but also in some countries, engineering as an entire sector is also regulated. And if it's regulated, it's very, very likely that a work permit is going to be needed. Does the member state require national insurance to be paid? I've indicated that it's now a matter, or will be a matter, for each member state to decide that. You'll have to make some inquiries in advance. Do you have to notify the member state before you send the worker? That normally is a prerequisite, and you'll need to get familiar with a pre-notification system that exists for the country where you're sending the worker. And is your worker visiting more than one member state? Because remember, if you get a work permit and you're paying national insurance and you've pre-notified for France, and they then travel to Belgium or to Germany, then you need to complete the whole process all over again. Now, if the UK leaves the EU, then provisionally the EU has added the UK to what we call the Schengen Visa Waiver Scheme. So this is a scheme whereby the EU can categorise certain countries as safe destinations such that they can enter the EU without having a visa first. Now, being on the Schengen Visa Waiver Scheme means that UK nationals can travel into the EU and live and work for 90 days in any rolling 180-day period. It covers multiple entries, so you can travel to France or Germany, but if you clock up 90 days in a 180-day period, then you need to leave the Schengen area, broadly most of the EU, return to the UK, or at least be out of the Schengen area, for 90 days. And once you've been outside for 90 days, then you can go back in and have your next 90 days. So if you like, there's a cooling off period of 90 days between those 90-day stay periods. But being on the Schengen visa list doesn't mean to say that we don't have to comply with the requirements of each member state. So each member state might have other entry requirements that have to be complied with. A UK worker will have to comply with those local rules. It's just the Schengen area that we're exempt from finding a visa in advance. So what are the Schengen visa requirements? Well, we don't just have a Schengen visa and therefore we can enter without any other administrative requirements. Schengen visas, the individual could be checked at both points of entry and exit. The individual will need a valid travel document. For most UK people, this means a passport because we don't have national ID cards. And the passport must have been issued within the last 10 years and have at least 6 months left before it expires. Not all UK passports last 10 years. Some last a bit more than 10 years. And there is a passport checking service. There's a link on the slide to make sure that you do have a passport that qualifies under the Schengen visa requirements. So what else are you going to need? You will need a written invitation from the firm that you are visiting in the Schengen area, a letter of authority from your employer to go. If you're attending a trade conference or a fair of some kind, then you need to have your entry tickets. If you're traveling for training or scientific or for R&D purposes, there is a slightly longer list to comply with. And you'll need evidence of your return journey, accommodation and subsistence. That's to make sure that you can support yourself whilst you're in the Schengen area. And if you're in the Schengen area for 2 or 3 months, then clearly the evidence of subsistence could be quite substantial. So all those documents you will need if you're visiting the Schengen area, and you could be checked when you go in and when you come out. What are the limitations on Schengen visas? Well, if you intend to work, then most member states will require a work permit. E-gates won't be available because you can't check those Schengen documents at an e-gate, and travellers will therefore face some delays and they'll be in the rest of the world queue at points of entry. Luggage could be subject to customs control. So currently we enter the Schengen area or we enter the European Union, we go through the blue channel, the EU channel. In the future, we'll need to either go through the red or the green channel. So we'll have to make a customs declaration. Stays for longer than 90 days generally require a local residence permit or a long-term visa. So they're possible, but only essentially with a permission from the member state that the person is staying in. The health insurance card, the EHIC card, will no longer be valid. The UK is trying to negotiate bilateral deals on health. It succeeded with Spain and Cyprus and Malta so far, but broadly, those are the only countries where we can access the health system and service. Credit card charges, they will be likely to go up again, and mobile phone roaming charges will come back in. Now, the Schengen visa system therefore provides some comfort for UK-based employers, but it can only really be used easily for business trips. So that's a business meeting or going to a trade fair. If you're providing services or you're going there for longer periods of time, then you're likely to need a local work permit. On the screen before you is a colour-coded chart of broadly the European Union and most countries in the EU. Now, what this shows you is how many days it takes to get work ready before you go to a specific country. So, for example, if you look at Italy, Italy takes up to 221 days to be work ready. It's a little bit better in some other countries. So Cyprus is 74 days, for example, and France 103. But clearly getting work permits and comply with local regulations, for example, the payment of national insurance, can take a considerable period of time for workers travelling into the European Union. That's all from me for this particular section, but look out for more podcasts and webcasts from Make UK dealing with other issues. Thank you.